Welcome to Eye to Market, a web series designed to help you explore and navigate the successful path to market for your ophthalmic innovation. Welcome to Eye to Market. My name is Brian and I'll be your host today.
There are other ways to try to de-risk a trial beyond, and a lot of it revolves around setting up the right trial. It starts, I think, with the endpoints. You want endpoints that are not just significant, but that are recognized by the regulators. I mean, you have to have, like it's been the mantra of visual improvement of like 15 letters. If you have a DME study and you have a wonderful OCT response in the past, that's just not been a primary endpoint that you could get approval on. Same for decreasing the number of injections. That isn't approvable in and of itself. And so, it may be counterintuitive, these things that would improve the benefit for the patient, but you need to understand or work with people that can advise you on setting up your trial and picking endpoints that will help you to achieve the ultimate success of regulatory approval. These are things that, there are experts in the field that can really help guide you in doing this, help you figure the power calculations and how many you need and to show a difference. And all these things are very important because the trials are very expensive, especially in retina, which is my field. They're very expensive to do, but the reward is very great at the end. In retina, it's the biggest chunk of the pie, as big as almost everything else combined, because of the price of all of our injectable biologics.
How do those endpoints mature and change over time?
Well, proof of concept studies tend to be on the smaller side. So we think we've identified a signal that we need to amplify, or identified new signals that we perhaps hadn't looked at. As we move along the journey, we are doing two things. We're scaling the number of patients that we're bringing into our trial, and we're narrowing our focus on what those endpoints are. So we're learning at each stage. It's not iterative exactly because the trials are different, but it's iterative in the sense that we take the learnings from each stage and we feed them into the next stage.
Okay.
But as the size of the trial starts to expand, we need to be more and more disciplined around the outcomes that we're looking to capture. I often say, and I think I did earlier in this conversation, that if you give a clinical trial too many jobs, you can end up with, and this is part of de-risking a trial, data that becomes not terribly compelling or usable for any of your stakeholders.
Yeah.
And that's a horrendous waste of resources, and now we've exposed patients to all of these, the clinical trial, their time, their experience. It's not good. So as we expand the trial, we become more and more disciplined in terms of what we're looking to capture for.
We'll move to the later trials in a minute, but when you're looking at that proof of concept, you're trying to get probably analytical measurements, right? Does it do this to the pupil? Does it reduce that amount of redness? What does it do to the retina thickness? Those types of things, right? How do you balance that with the subjective data, knowing that the patient is the center of all of this, right? How do we balance the patient experience data with the analytical data to make sure we have the right data, but not too much data, that we're overwhelmed by it?
Yeah. I mean, it's a challenge. I'm not going to tell you that there's an easy button for that. And sometimes it's very challenging. Ultimately, our heart is with the patient. Does our innovation meet the need that we intend for it to meet?
Okay.
And so we need to know that the outcomes that we're targeting are driving us towards that decision point. If along the journey we capture additional data, which inevitably we do, that takes us off track a little bit, that might distract us somewhat from the thing we're trying to target, then I think in the proof of concept environment, there's some flexibility there to like I said, be open-minded. But ultimately, we always pull ourselves back to how do we stay on track. We're looking to have a particular outcome to serve the patients in this particular way. And so we might have to let go.
Okay.
let go of some of the analytics that we think might be super interesting to chase down and go down the rabbit hole, and could we go here, there, and multiple different directions. I have the heart of a scientist. I grew up in a scientific environment, and so those types of scenarios are very, very appealing. Because you realize they're questions you hadn't asked, that now you have the opportunity to ask. But of course, we have a responsibility to the business and to our patients to kind of stay on track. So it's a balancing act at that stage. Later in the clinical trial process, it's easier.
Okay.
Because you've now identified the signal that you know you need to amplify. You've got multiple cross-functional stakeholder, internal, external input. Everybody's aligned on what we're going after, and it's just a matter of efficiently executing.
As you consult with clients at Aura and the innovators that are bringing these new projects to market, what are some of the strategies that you work with them on to help make sure that what the clinical trial is going to result in is maximizing the resources you have at hand and targeting the right endpoints?
Yeah, great question. I think it's important probably to take one step back and assess who is the client and what is the client's ultimate goal. It's not always the case that every client we work with wants to develop a product to the point of marketing it. So we actually see quite a few smaller clients, biotechs, where their goal is only to do one study and then to find a partner to either acquire them or acquire the asset. In those particular cases, the objective of the trial and the endpoints, the strategy that you put in place really does vary considerably from perhaps a large pharma company, where it's a more deliberate process that they go through in terms of establishing proof of concept, expanding in phase 2 to de-risk their phase 3s, and then very sort of conservative phase 3 approaches as well.
As you work with folks like that and you're creating that proof of concept study plan design, what are some of the things that you try to do to make sure that it's as lean as possible, cost effective as possible?
This is a situation where certain indications lend themselves to perhaps more efficiencies than others. And in an indication like geographic atrophy, for example, it's progressive, it's slow, it doesn't move to an endpoint that you feel comfortable with very quickly. There's not always an easy way out of that to make that process more efficient. But in diseases, wet AMD, diabetic macular edema, where drying out the retina can give you an immediate bump in best corrected visual acuity, there are some opportunities to be more efficient with how you do those proof of concept trials. So in general, I think it again goes back to understanding what the sponsor's goal is with the research, designing the trial around achieving that goal, and if it has to be something that's a little bit more elaborate to sort of get to that objective, you can do it that way. If it's something where you can streamline and really go for very narrow approach, specific endpoint, you can take that strategy as well.
As we design these clinical trials, we're going to be having multiple stakeholders, be it internal stakeholders at a large pharma, or in some of the innovators' cases, we're going to have investors, regulators, clinicians, people are going to eventually be marketing this product to. How do the endpoints, the importance of those differ from those different categories? Yeah. And is it a difference in endpoint or just a difference in how we communicate that endpoint?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I do think there's some overlap with respect to an acquiring group, a larger pharma, and a regulator. In many cases, they're looking for something that's de-risked based on an endpoint that could be considered clinically meaningful and approvable. So I tend to see some overlap there. And for each of the main indications that we work in, there are specific endpoints that regulators accept. There's fairly well-defined thresholds for how much benefit you need to show for that product to be approvable. The challenge comes in a couple of indications. So when you look at rare disease, when you look at inherited retinal disease, small populations where endpoints don't necessarily actually fit the disease terribly well. And in many cases, the technology, some of the really innovative gene therapies that have been developed, the technologies actually have in many ways surpassed the regulatory process and the regulatory understanding of how to evaluate the products. So there's, I think, a a lot that needs to be kind of unpacked there with respect to endpoints. Some diseases are pretty clear. You don't want to deviate too far from it. You may be in a situation with a smaller company where they feel comfortable not going the full distance that's required by a regulator to show benefit at, say, 12 months. Maybe they're comfortable showing benefit at 6 months and saying, we're going to cut that study a little shorter, save some money, but we feel confident if it's working at 6, it's going to continue to work at 12. But there's definitely a lot of space still where there's a lack of clarity regarding what endpoints are best fits for certain populations, and we tend to see that in rare disease, and it's a challenge. You have tremendous advocacy groups like the FFB that try to perform natural history studies to increase the understanding of how the endpoints move within some of these rare disease populations. But at the same time, I think there's more work needed there by industry and regulators to sort of partner and come up with a sort of a cohesive understanding of what is beneficial in some of these patient populations where traditional endpoints don't apply.
So one of the things that you mentioned was building a study with, I think the words you used were everything but the kitchen sink, right? So I want to test for clinical, I want to test for regulatory, I want to test for that. But obviously one of the bigger concerns when it comes to developing a clinical trial for some of our investors and our innovators is going to be the cost.
Yeah.
So how can I go about building a clinical trial that achieves the goals that we're looking to do, but the leanest, most cost-effective way possible?
Yeah. Also, a really important reason to start to work with the appropriate partner and or CRO early. It's a balancing act. You have to have a well-designed trial with robust enough data to give us confidence. And even if we're a little bit off in what we thought, we want to have enough data to do some data mining to understand, to inform the next program. But there's ways to do this, right? So ways of having a smaller study to de-risk operational issues, scientific issues, and some tricks of the trade are things like maybe include 1 or 2 sites. Don't do a multi-center study early where you may have more variability.
Okay.
Make sure that the endpoints are incredibly well controlled, right? You may have the best molecule, the best protocol, but if your endpoints aren't well controlled, you're going to get variability and you're going to miss the signal, especially in a small trial. So everything that needs to be controlled operationally, scientifically, even down to things like choosing the right clinical scale. You think about ocular surface disease, and you think about keratitis and conjunctival staining. Well, there's probably 5 different scales out there, but which one is the most sensitive? Which one is going to give you the best signal? Which one's reflective of the actual anatomy and the disease and will translate clinically? So we say the devil's in the details, and it's all these little things that you need to think about. But if you do a reasonably sized study at a couple of centers and it's very well controlled, what that translates to is a lot of statistical power. So you can actually see a signal in a small study. And if you don't think about those things or control those things, then it's like throwing Jell-O against the wall, and then it's a waste of time and money, quite frankly. So there's a lot of things that can be done.
So when conducting a clinical trial, we'll typically have multiple endpoints. Many of them will be physiological, right? We're going to do a test here. We're going to measure this. We're going to notate that. And then there's the subjective measurements. There's the patient experience piece. How critical are those 2 elements as you balance out a clinical trial?
Excellent question. I would say that depending on the indication, they can both be equally important. However, I would say that patient-reported outcomes and subjective endpoints are essential. They're critical. If you think about it, if it's a patient that's suffering from a disease and think about ocular discomfort or pain, the product has to make them feel better. If it doesn't make them feel better, the product won't do well, right? And unfortunately, we see that there's some products out there that are intended to reduce symptoms, but they actually are irritating upon installation, and it seems a little funny, right? But anyways, the point is that symptoms are really important. It's the patient experience. They are the customer. They're the ones that are going to say this is good. It's going to drive compliance, so they're going to want to use the drug, and it's going to drive efficacy. But if you say, this clinical sign shows an improvement in, say, tear production, but the patient feels no better, it's not going to really do that well.